The sweat made it harder than it should have been. My fingers slipped again, and the edge of the plastic stayed stubborn, mocking me. I wiped my hand on my jeans, slick with a sheen of grime from a day too long spent under the thick heat of the forest. There's something humiliating about fighting with a piece of plastic. Something so small, so insignificant, yet it's winning. My heart was pounding, just like it had been for days, thumping against my ribs like it was trying to escape. But there was nowhere to run, not here. I finally caught the edge, the tiniest strip of it peeling away from the tape like dead skin. It took a few tries, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. Plastic gave up, releasing the cassette. I held it in my hand for a moment, staring at it. The tape gleamed in the dim light, reflecting the little bits of sunlight that managed to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. It was such a small thing, really. A relic. Who even used these anymore? But that's what I had. A dusty tape recorder and this old cassette. One shot at telling the truth. The recorder sat on the table, battered, scratched. Its buttons felt worn smooth under my thumb, like they'd been pressed 1,000 times before. But not by me. I slid the tape in, hearing the soft click as it locked into place. My hands hovered over the buttons for a second like I wasn't sure what I was about to do. My thumb pressed record. A sharp hiss filled the air, the kind of sound that crawls under your skin, making your teeth ache. For a second I thought it wasn't going to work, that this whole thing was pointless. But then I heard it. Faint, distant, the soft whir of the tape turning like the dead coming to life. I leaned closer, holding my breath. A sound emerged, low and distorted, the crackle of static melting into something that almost felt like a heartbeat. Mine or the recorder's? I couldn't tell anymore. It worked. I let out a shaky breath, one I hadn't realized I was holding, and settled back into the chair. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against the walls, the silence outside waiting, watching, as if the trees were listening too. My name? That doesn't matter. Not now, not anymore. Names are just labels, things people hang on to feel tethered to the world. What matters are the things we do, the things we leave behind. And if you're listening to this, you'll understand soon enough. The tape whirred, its low hum filling the cabin, and for a moment I just sat there, listening to it, letting it steady me. There's something about that sound, like it's spinning your thoughts into threads, pulling them out of you whether you're ready or not. I wasn't sure I was ready. My earliest memories are a blur, just flickers really, images that don't stay long enough for me to grasp them. I see my father's face sometimes in dreams, though it's not really his face. It's more like an impression, a shadow of someone who should have been there but wasn't. He died when I was too young to understand what dying meant. Just a fever that wouldn't break, skin that turned cold too soon, and then silence. I don't remember his voice or the way he laughed or even what he smelled like. Just absence. What came after that? Well, that's clear. Too clear. My mother, hollowed out by grief, turned to the only thing that could fill the empty space inside her, the bottle. And after that, the men. They came and went like the seasons. Some stayed for a week, some for months, but none of them ever stuck around long enough for me to get used to them. Didn't stop them from making themselves at home, though. The thing about those men, about the way they moved through our house, was how easy it was for them to forget I was there. Or maybe they didn't forget. Maybe that's why they did what they did. The way their hands would lash out when life got too heavy for them. The way they'd sneer, or worse, ignore me entirely. It was like I wasn't a person to them. Just some reminder of their own failures, their own frustrations. I can still feel their fists sometimes, like echoes that never really fade. I learned to stay quiet, to keep out of sight, to wait for the sound of the front door slamming so I'd know when it was safe to come out from whatever corner I'd hidden in. But that kind of silence sticks to you, seeps into your bones, makes you feel invisible. I was maybe 12, 13, old enough to know how things worked by then. When Mom introduced him, I figured he'd be like the others. His name didn't matter. None of their names did. They all blurred together after a while. But he was different. He had a way about him. A calm, quiet kind of presence that made the room feel safer. He didn't drink much, didn't yell, Didn't take his bad days out on me. He actually looked at me when he spoke, called me son even though I wasn't his. It was the first time in a long while that I felt like I was something more than an afterthought, like I mattered, at least to him. He took me fishing once, just the two of us. It wasn't far, just a small pond a couple miles from the house. We didn't catch anything. It didn't matter. I remember sitting next to him on the bank, the sun just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting everything in this soft orange glow. He didn't say much, just patted me on the shoulder every so often, like he was trying to tell me that everything was going to be okay. It was the first time I felt safe, like I had someone in my corner, someone who wasn't going to hurt me or leave me behind. It was a feeling I wanted to hold on to, more than anything. I started calling him Uncle. It felt right. He wasn't my dad. No one could fill that gap. He was something. He was good. But that didn't last either. Mom couldn't keep a good thing. Or maybe she didn't want to. Eventually he stopped being enough. The bottle called louder, and when his pockets ran dry, she found someone else to fill them. Just like that, he was gone. Thrown out like yesterday's news. I didn't think I'd ever see him again. But one night, he came back. I heard the knock on the door and ran to open it before she could. I can still picture him standing there, looking tired, older somehow, like the weight of the world had finally caught up to him, but he smiled when he saw me. That same soft smile.
"Hey, kid,"
he whispered, voice low, like he didn't want to wake the ghosts in the house. Before I could say anything, my mother appeared behind me, already half drunk, her words slurred and sharp. They exchanged a few heated words. Her, demanding money. Him, saying he didn't have any more to give. She laughed at him like he was nothing. And then he made her an offer. He had a couple bottles of bourbon tucked under his arm, probably all he had left. He held them out to her, and I watched her eyes light up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She grabbed the bottles, but before she could shut the door in his face, he said something that stopped her cold.
"I'll take him,"
he said, nodding toward me.
"You don't want him. I'll take him off your hands."
For a second I thought she'd say no, that maybe, deep down, she still cared enough to hold on to me. But then she shrugged, like it didn't matter, and like I didn't matter.
"Sure, take that bastard with you. I don't give a shit."
And just like that, the deal was done. She traded me for 2 bottles of bourbon, and I walked out that door with Uncle, leaving everything else behind. I wish I could say I felt sad about it. I wish I could say it hurt, but it didn't. All I felt was relief. For the first time in my life, I had someone who wanted me, someone who chose me. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I was never alone, not with Uncle. That much I knew. Even in those early days, when we didn't have much more than the clothes on our backs and a couple of cans between us, I knew he'd always have my back. He watched me like a hawk, always there, always watching. Sometimes I thought it was too much, like he was hovering, but then I'd catch the look in his eyes. He wasn't watching out of suspicion. It was fear, the kind that wrapped itself around both of us, made me realize that he wasn't just looking out for me because he felt obligated. He did it because he cared, because I was all he had, just like he was all I had. There was a day, years ago now, that sticks with me like a splinter I can't dig out. It was late spring, the trees just starting to thicken with leaves. Uncle had taken me out to the woods behind the rundown shack we were renting at the time. He said it was time I learned how to shoot.
"A man ought to know how to handle a rifle, son,"
he'd say, voice steady like he was giving me some ancient wisdom handed down through generations. We didn't have much. An old .22 he'd scraped together some cash for. But that rifle became my world for the afternoon. We set up a couple of empty cans on a fallen log, the forest swallowing us in its silence except for the soft crunch of dead leaves underfoot. He handed me the rifle, and I remember it felt heavier than I thought it would.
"Now, steady yourself,"
he said, placing his rough hand on my shoulder.
"Keep your eyes on the target. Don't let the world around you distract you. Just the target. That's all that matters."
I tried, really did. But I was nervous and my hands kept shaking. I squinted down the barrel, trying to focus on the little speck of silver gleaming in the sun, but my heart was pounding in my chest. each beat making the gun wobble just a little more. He crouched beside me, his breath slow, deliberate, like he was trying to pass his calm into me. He pointed down the barrel with one finger, his other hand still gripping my shoulder.
You know what you're aiming for?
I nodded. The bullessy? He chuckled. That low, warm laugh he saved for moments like these when he thought something was funny but didn't want to embarrass me.
Bullseye, son. Say it again.
I blushed. Bullseye.
There you go. Now you aim for that, and when you think you got it lined up, you breathe. Don't rush it. Just breathe in, steady, and then squeeze.
He backed up a little, gave me space. I tried again, the words still rattling in my head. Bullseye. That's all I had to do. Hit the bullseye. The rifle jerked in my hands when I pulled the trigger. The crack echoed through the trees, but when I looked, the can was still sitting there, mocking me. I let out a frustrated sigh, lowering the rifle, but he just smiled.
You'll get it,
he said, ruffling my hair.
Ain't about hitting it the first time. It's about learning how to miss, so you can do better next time.
He stood up and walked over to the cans, resetting them.
Try again.
I did. And again. And again. I missed more times than I could count, but every time, Uncle was there, patient as a saint, showing me how to hold the rifle just right, how to keep my breath steady, how to squeeze the trigger like I meant it. By the end of the day, I hit the can dead center. When I looked over, Uncle had that proud smile on his face, the one that always made my chest swell with something warm and heavy.
That's my boy,
he said, clapping a hand on my back.
Knew you could do it.
Years passed, and life didn't get much easier for either of us. Work came and went in spurts, but it was never enough to lift us out of the hole we'd found ourselves in. But we had each other. That was the thing. As long as we had that, we could keep going. I'd been at work, just a few miles away, when I got the call. A neighbor had found him on the ground, his left side completely useless, his voice gone. The stroke hit hard and fast, and by the time I got to the hospital, it was like part of him had already slipped away. The doctor said there wasn't much they could do. He'd never walk right again, and the words that had once flowed out of him, those gruff little quips and advice, were lost. I remember standing there, staring at him lying in that hospital bed, his eyes half open, his lips twitching like he was trying to tell me something, but all that came out was this low, broken sound. It wasn't fair. Not to him. Not to me. I didn't have the money to give him the care he needed. Hell, I barely had enough to keep us afloat as it was. So I made a decision. I found this place online. Cheap, run down, but out in the middle of nowhere. A cabin in the forest where we could live off the land, where I could take care of him without needing anyone else. Just us, like it always had been. Uncle didn't complain when I told him. He couldn't really. But I saw it in his eyes, the acceptance. Maybe even a little relief. We packed what little we had and moved out to the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough for us. The forest was thick around us. The kind of place where you could forget the rest of the world even existed. Uncle sat by the window most days, just staring out into the trees, his cane resting against the side of his chair, his leg trembling with the effort of just staying upright, but he still watched over me. Even in his silence, I could feel it. That quiet protectiveness. That way he had of making me feel like no matter what came, no matter how hard things got, I wasn't alone. He'd taught me how to hunt, how to forage, how to live off the land. Those lessons stuck with me, carried me through those first few months. I could still hear his voice in my head sometimes, guiding me through the woods.
Steady. Watch your step. The forest doesn't care about you like I do.
Now it's just me and him in this cabin, just the two of us, like it always was. And no matter how quiet the days get, how heavy the nights feel, I know we could handle it. The first time we went hunting, I couldn't keep my damn mouth shut. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the leaves, I'd whisper questions or comments, the excitement bubbling up in me like I couldn't contain it. Uncle never yelled, not even when I knew I was being frustrating. He'd just stop, turn to me, and put a finger to his lips, those steady eyes of his boring into mine like he was willing me to understand without words. But I didn't, not at first. I was too green, too eager. That was years before the stroke. Back then, Uncle could still speak still bark instructions in that low, gravelly voice of his, but he didn't waste words. He preferred silence. There was something calming about the way he moved through the woods. Slow, deliberate, like he was part of the forest, not some intruder blundering through it like I was. It took me a while to realize that hunting wasn't about the kill. It was about listening, feeling the rhythm of the world around you, becoming invisible. After the stroke, Uncle couldn't tell me to be quiet anymore. He'd try, God, he'd try, but his mouth wouldn't work the way it used to. The words were trapped in his head like birds beating against a cage, and when they came out they were mangled, half-formed, but he still took me out into the woods, still insisted on teaching me. The forest had been his escape for as long as I could remember. It was the one place where he felt in control, where the world wasn't spinning too fast for him to keep up, and even after his body betrayed him, the forest was still ours. We were out there one afternoon, tracking a buck through the underbrush. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that settles deep in your lungs and stays with you. Uncle was moving ahead of me, his limp more pronounced now, the left side of his body dragging with every step. I was behind him, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but my foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves. The sound was too loud in the stillness, like a gunshot. A deer somewhere just beyond the clearing startled and bolted. I cursed under my breath, but before I could say anything, Uncle turned around. He didn't need to speak. His eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto mine, and his lips moved, slow and deliberate. I'd gotten used to it by then, watching the way his mouth moved, trying to piece together the words he couldn't say aloud. It wasn't perfect, and there were times when I'd get it wrong, but we had a kind of unspoken language between us. I could read him, and he could read me. He mouthed the words, and I saw it clear as day.
Stay quiet. Breathe.
I nodded, taking a slow, steady breath, just like he taught me. The world around us stilled again, the forest settling back into its rhythm. Uncle patted me on the shoulder, his way of telling me it was okay, that I'd learn. We spent hours out there that day, not saying a word. Uncle couldn't, and I didn't need to. We just moved together, slow and quiet, slipping through the trees like shadows. Over time I got better at it, at reading his lips, at understanding what he wanted me to do without him having to say it. There was a kind of intimacy in that, a closeness I don't think I ever realized we had before. The stroke had taken his voice, but not the way we communicated. I think in some ways, it made me even more attuned to him. When we'd sit by the fire after a long day of hunting or foraging, he'd watch me with those same eyes, and I'd see the small movements of his mouth, the way he'd form the words he couldn't say, and I knew. I always knew what he was trying to tell me.
You did good today, son.
The recorder hissed as the tape clicked to a stop. I sat there for a second, staring at the machine, feeling the weight of the silence fill the room. My fingers trembled as I popped the cassette out, flipping it over to side B. The tape felt cold, like it had been sitting in the dark for too long. I pushed it back into the recorder and pressed record, the familiar whirring sound filling the cabin once again. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my eyes, trying to ignore the ache in my bones. The light outside was fading fast, a strange kind of dimness that seemed to seep into everything. It wasn't just the sun setting. It was like the air itself was going out, pulling the life out of the trees, the ground, the cabin. The shadows stretched longer than they should, twisting into the corners of the room like fingers reaching for something. The forest, once our refuge, felt like it was pressing in, suffocating. One day, years after I'd learned to keep my mouth shut in the woods, we were out hunting. We'd tracked a deer for hours, moving quietly through the underbrush. I still remember the way the light filtered through the trees that day, like we were walking through a dream, everything hazy and soft. The forest was calm, almost peaceful, and for a moment I thought maybe things were finally falling into place for us. We were out there, doing what we always did, working together, surviving together. I spotted the deer first, a young buck grazing at the edge of a clearing, and I remember catching his eyes again, watching as he mouthed something I hadn't heard him say in years.
Bullseye.
I lined up the shot, steadying my breath just like he taught me. The rifle cracked and the buck dropped instantly, the sound echoing through the woods. I turned to Uncle, feeling that familiar swell of pride when I saw his nod of approval. "I'll get the deer," I told him. "You head back to the cabin, I'll be there soon." He didn't argue, just gave me a small wave, the corner of his mouth twitching into something like a smile. I watched him limp off, his cane tapping softly against the dirt, his body moving in that slow, deliberate way it always did. When I got back, Uncle wasn't there. At first I thought maybe he'd wandered off to get water, or maybe he was just moving slow, but the longer I waited, the more my gut twisted. I walked back to where we'd parted ways, following the trail he should have taken. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. That's when I saw it. His cane, lying on the ground not far from where we'd separated. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, like ice crawling up my neck. Uncle never went anywhere without it. He couldn't, not after the stroke. But there it was, abandoned in the dirt, and no sign of him. No tracks, no struggle, just nothing. I called his name, my voice bouncing off the trees, swallowed by the silence. I searched for hours, retracing every step we'd taken that day, looking for any clue, any hint of where he could have gone. My mind kept racing, trying to make sense of it. He couldn't have just disappeared, couldn't have walked away without his cane. But the forest stretched on in every direction, endless and empty. By nightfall, I was a mess. My hands were shaking, my throat raw from shouting. I barely slept, tossing and turning, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. The next day I searched again, and the next. I kept moving, my legs aching, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. I ran into a couple of poachers on the third day, their dirty clothes and rifles slung over their shoulders. They looked like they'd been out here too long, just like me. I asked if they'd seen anyone. An old man, limping, maybe confused. But they just shook their heads, muttering something about how these woods could swallow a man whole. Their eyes lingered on me, though, like they knew something. Something they weren't telling me. That night I sat by the window, staring out into the blackness, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe he'd fallen somewhere, waiting for me to find him. Maybe the forest had taken him. I didn't want to believe it, but the longer I stared into those trees, the more I felt it. The forest wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It was alive, and it was hungry. On the third day I saw him. It was early morning, the fog still hanging low over the ground. I was sitting on the porch, barely able to keep my eyes open, when something moved at the edge of the tree line. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe one of the poachers again. But then I saw the figure, Uncle. He was walking toward the cabin, but something was wrong. He wasn't using his cane. His body was off, not just the limp. He'd had that for years. But the way his whole frame seemed to jerk, like his bones didn't fit inside him anymore. His movements were stiff, broken, like someone was trying to move him from the inside, but couldn't quite figure out how. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, watching him stumble closer. He was still far away, maybe a couple 100 yards, but I could see him clearly. His mouth was moving. I squinted, trying to make out the words, and then I saw it.
Run.
My blood went cold. He was mouthing the word over and over, his lips forming the shape of it, desperate, like he was trying to scream but couldn't. I froze, confused, my mind spinning. What did he mean? Why would he want me to? I took a step toward him, and that's when it happened. His body shifted, snapping upright like something had taken hold of him. The limp was gone, replaced by this unnatural stillness. His head jerked to the side, and I swear to God, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from his throat. Then he sprinted toward me. It wasn't him. Couldn't have been. His arms, God, his arms weren't arms anymore. They were jagged, bone-white blades, protruding from the skin, like he'd torn himself apart from the inside. His face was contorted in pain, mouth open in a silent scream as his body tore itself apart, turning into something monstrous. I couldn't think. I just ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning as my feet pounded the earth. I could hear him, hear the sickening crunch of bone and flesh shifting into something unnatural, something that wasn't him anymore. I could feel him gaining smell of rot and something metallic, like rusted iron. Then through the blur of panic I saw them. 2 poachers. They were standing by a pile of dead game, rifles slung over their shoulders, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I screamed, "Help me!" My voice cracked, raw from the panic. They looked up, confused at first, their faces blank. I couldn't quite make out what was happening. I waved frantically, trying to make them understand. "He's gonna kill me." They finally saw what was behind me, what was coming, and their expressions changed. One of them, a tall, scruffy man with a wild beard, swore under his breath. The other one, younger but no less ragged, fumbled for his rifle. Uncle was almost on top of me. I could hear the wet, animal-like breath behind me, the slashing of his limbs cutting through the air, tearing through anything in his path. A shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The tall poacher fired first, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. The bullet hit Uncle, hit square in the chest, but the thing didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. The tall poacher's eyes went wide with shock, but he fired again. Another shot, then another. The younger poacher raised his own rifle, his hands shaking as he pulled the trigger. A spray of bullets rattled through the air, but the thing kept coming, unfazed by the lead tearing through its flesh. The poachers were shouting now, cursing, their voices high-pitched with fear. I was still running, half stumbling toward them, praying they could stop it. But nothing stopped it. The thing reached the clearing where the poachers stood, its body twisting in a grotesque, unnatural way, as if it was struggling to hold itself together. It wasn't just a limp now. It was as if its whole skeleton was fighting against its own skin, bones jutting out at odd angles, limbs moving in sharp, unnatural jerks. The tall poacher emptied his clip, the rifle chamber clicking as he fired his last shot.
"Cover me! Reloading!"
he screamed, his hands shaking as he reached for more ammo. The younger one dropped a cartridge in the dirt, scrambling to pick it up, his eyes darting between the monster and his rifle. The third poacher, who had been farther back, heard the shots and came running. He raised his rifle, spraying bullets wildly as the thing came closer, too panicked to aim. His shots barely grazed it. It screamed, a low guttural sound, then its body jerked unnaturally, limbs snapping, the bones in its arms shifting like they were trying to escape its skin. The thing that had been my uncle reached the younger poacher before the man could get another round off. It lunged faster than I thought possible, one of those horrible, twisted arms slicing through the air like a blade. There was a wet thunk, the sound of flesh parting, bones splintering, and the man's body folded in half, blood spraying in an arc across the clearing. His head, it rolled to the side, eyes wide, still blinking. I tasted bile in my throat, my mind screaming at me to look away, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, watching as the thing moved to the bearded poacher. Still fumbling with his rifle, let out a strangled yell as the thing turned on him. He raised his hands in a futile attempt to protect himself, but it was too late. Those grotesque, jagged limbs swung down on him. The blades ripped through his chest, tearing him apart. His body crumpled to the ground, torn open, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The third poacher, desperate, eyes wide, tried to run, but the thing moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. It lashed out, its arm extending unnaturally, catching the man by the back of the neck. I watched in horror as it pulled him in, closer and closer, till its mouth, twisted and misshapen, was inches from his face.
"Please!"
The poacher gasped. The thing didn't hesitate. Its blade pierced through his chest with a sickening crunch, and the man's body fell, blood soaking the earth beneath him. I stood there, frozen, my body refusing to move, my mind lagging behind the nightmare unfolding in front of me. The thing, the monster, stood over the torn bodies of the poachers, its bladed arms dripping with blood, its breath a wet, ragged rasp that seemed to suck the air from the forest itself. Its whole body convulsed, twitching violently as if something inside it was fighting, trying to tear free from the grotesque skin and bones that no longer fit together. And then it turned toward me, but not its body. Its head twisted first, just the head, slowly, impossibly. The neck cracked, bones popping as it jerked, twisted, and craned toward me. Its face, Uncle's face, though barely recognizable anymore, was upside down, staring at me with dead eyes, those dark, hollow pits where his warm gaze used to be. The mouth hung open, blood smeared across his chin, but no sound came. The body remained still, facing the other way, but that head, it just kept turning, grotesquely, until it faced me completely, disjointed and wrong. And then, in an instant, the body moved, catching up with the twisted neck. Its legs jerked into action, and it lunged at me, bladed arms slashing the air, cutting through the space where I'd stood just moments before. My legs moved before I could think. Instinct kicked in. Pure, raw survival. I bolted, the forest blurring around me as I pushed harder, faster than I'd ever run in my life. The ground tore at my feet, roots and rocks catching my ankles, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back, not after what I'd just seen. I was running blind now, just moving wherever the forest would let me. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something glint near a truck parked by the edge of the clearing, the poacher's truck. A sidearm dropped in the dirt in their panic. I didn't think. I just dove for it, my hand closing around the cold metal. The thing was too close now. Too close. I scrambled to my feet, the gun heavy in my trembling hands as I bolted away, my heart thundering in my chest, and just as I felt like I might be getting away, I felt it. A sharp, blinding pain tore across my back. I screamed, stumbling forward as the thing's bladed arms slashed into me, cutting deep through skin and muscle. I could feel the hot rush of blood, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The pain surged through me, white-hot and searing, but adrenaline pushed me forward. My legs kept moving, the gun still clutched in my hand, blood dripping down my spine as I ran, stumbling, barely holding it together. The forest opened up ahead of me, and that's when I saw it, the cliff. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked over the edge. There was nowhere left to go, just the yawning chasm below. The wind howling up from the depths, pulling at me like it wanted to drag me down. I turned, the sidearm shaking in my hands, my back burning from the slash, blood seeping into my shirt. The thing, Uncle, the monster, whatever it was, emerged from the shadows of the trees, its body jerking in that horrible, unnatural way, its bladed arms dragging through the dirt, carving deep gouges into the earth. It was over. I knew it. There was nowhere to run. I fell to my knees, the weight of the gun heavy in my hands as I pointed it toward the thing. I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. I couldn't. My hands shook too much, the pain too overwhelming. The sight of Uncle, what used to be Uncle, breaking me in ways I couldn't understand. My chest heaved as I choked back a sob, the gun still raised, but my finger frozen over the trigger.
Dad.
The words slipped out, quiet and broken. I had never called him that, not once, but in that moment I couldn't call him anything else. He wasn't just Uncle. He was the man who raised me, who taught me how to survive, who stood by me when no one else would. The thing froze mid-step, its body convulsing again, its twisted limbs shaking violently as if something inside was fighting to break free. Its head jerked to the side, mouth hanging open, and for a moment, for the briefest, horrible moment, it almost looked like Uncle again. My uncle. His lips moved, silently forming a word. I could read it. I knew what he said.
Bullseye.
My breath hitched. My hands steadied. I raised the gun. The shot rang out, louder than anything I had ever heard. It hit him right between the eyes, but the thing didn't fall. It staggered, its body still jerking, twitching, bones shifting beneath the skin like they were trying to escape. The lips moved again, that same word forming silently in the air. I pulled the trigger again. Another shot, and then another. I emptied the entire magazine into its head, each shot hitting the same spot until the click of the gun echoed in the silence. The chamber empty. He finally collapsed. The body crumpled in on itself, the twisted bones breaking through the skin, tearing it apart. The sound was grotesque, wet and hollow, like the earth itself was swallowing him. Blood pooled around the body, dark and thick, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared, the empty gun in my hands, the cliff behind me, the monster in front of me, and somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I could still hear him. I don't know how long I stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, staring at the thing that had once been my father. Time had stopped making sense. Everything had stopped making sense. The wind whipped around me, pulling at my clothes, tugging me toward the edge of the cliff, but I couldn't move. My body felt too heavy, my mind too numb. I could still feel the pain in my back, the hot, sharp sting of the wound, but it didn't seem real anymore. Nothing did. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat, pounding in my ears, and that single word still echoing in my mind. The tape whirred on, filling the cabin with the soft, steady hum. I sat there still, the silence pressing in around me like a heavy, suffocating weight. My hands hovered over the recorder, trembling slightly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The dull ache in my back had returned, spreading like a slow poison. I shifted in my seat, trying to find some comfort, but it only made it worse. It's when I felt it, the bones inside me. They moved, just a little at first, barely noticeable. But then it came again, a sharp, jarring sensation, like my insides were shifting, pushing against my skin. I gritted my teeth, biting back a groan, my fingers digging into the arms of the chair as another wave hit me. My spine twisted, something popping inside me, and I felt it. Like something underneath the bone, beneath the flesh, trying to claw its way out. I sucked in a sharp breath, trying to hold myself together, trying to stop the convulsions from taking over. But they came again, stronger this time, my muscles jerking involuntarily, my vision blurring with pain. It was happening. I had known it would, but that didn't make it any easier. I reached for the recorder, my hands slick with sweat, my voice coming out ragged, barely above a whisper. It's been 3 days since it happened. I winced as my body convulsed again, a sharp crack echoing from somewhere deep in my chest. My breath hitched and I forced myself to keep going, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. If you're hearing this, and if you see me, my body, don't hesitate. You have to empty a clip. Don't stop. Make sure I don't spread this. Another shudder rippled through me, my spine curving unnaturally, the chair creaking beneath me as my legs twitched violently. I clenched my jaw, fighting through the pain, knowing this was the only way. I looked down at the gun resting on the table, its cold weight familiar but distant now, like it belonged to someone else. My hands shook as I reached for it, sliding in the magazine. The act felt final, like sealing my fate, like I was closing a door on something that should have stayed shut. My thumb slid over the cold metal of the safety and I cocked the pin, the soft click filling the small room, echoing louder than it should have. The convulsions came again, stronger, my bones shifting under the skin, my hands trembling uncontrollably. A sharp pain tore through me, bending me forward, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I knew what was coming. I could feel it creeping up my spine, crawling through my muscles, reshaping me from the inside out. But I wasn't going to let it win. This curse ends with me. I raised the gun, holding it steady, forcing myself to take one final deep breath. For Dad.